Good morning and welcome to Rising. We have a great show for you today. I'm Amber Duke, joined again by Jessica Burbank. Pro-Palestine encampments and protests swelled on major U.S. college campuses across the country, from Texas and California to Atlanta and New York. Despite universities' best efforts to dismantle them, they continue unabated. Demonstrations intensified after several schools turned to law enforcement, who responded with force, including pepper spraying, pushing, shoving, and even tackling demonstrators.
Get on the ground! Get on the ground! I said, dog! Get on the ground! Oh my God! Oh my God! Oh my God! Give me some cops!
Several hundred people were arrested, including 2 professors at Emory University in Georgia, Caroline Folan and Noel McAfee. Meanwhile, the University of Southern California canceled its commencement ceremony next month, citing safety concerns.
Protesters are objecting to the war in Gaza, with several demonstrations demanding that administration should boycott, divest, and sanction. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu weighed in on Wednesday. Let's take a look at that.
What's happening on America's college campuses is horrific. Anti-Semitic mobs have taken over leading universities. They call for the annihilation of Israel. They attack Jewish students. They attack Jewish faculty. This is reminiscent of what happened in German universities in the 1930s. It's unconscionable. It has to be stopped. It has to be condemned, and condemned unequivocally.
Netanyahu urged everyone, Jews and non-Jews, to stand up to anti-Semitism. He did not signal any end, though, to Israel's bloody campaign in Gaza. President Biden seems unmoved. He signed a $16 billion bill this week that will give more money to Israel. This as calls of Genocide Joe ring louder across college campuses. Morehouse College students and some faculty are drumming up criticism against President Biden's planned commencement address there during graduation this year because of what they call his mishandling of the Israel-Hamas war. Meanwhile, President Trump, or former President Trump, could not help but kick in his 2 cents from New York, where he is standing trial for alleged election interference. Let's watch.
As you look at the various colleges all over the country and beyond colleges, because it's happening in other areas too, you see what's happening on the front having to do with Palestine and Israel and protests and hate, anger. Biden is sending an absolutely horrible message. Horrible, horrible message. He has no idea how to message. He can't speak. He can't put 2 sentences together. He doesn't know what to do. This is not our president. This is somebody that shouldn't be doing what he's doing because he can't do it. He can't do it well. We're having protests all over. He was talking about Charlottesville. Charlottesville was a little peanut, and it was nothing compared, and the hate wasn't the kind of hate that you have here. This is tremendous hate, and we have a man that can't talk about it because he doesn't understand it. He doesn't understand what's going on with our country.
Now, I want to go back to what Benjamin Netanyahu was saying there for a second. To compare protests against Israel's killing of 30,000 Palestinians, 70% were women and children. To compare that to protests in Nazi Germany or demonstrations in Nazi Germany, it's just not a fair comparison. It's a ridiculous media tactic to try and continue to draw on sentiments around World War II while Israel's army is the one committing the atrocities here. It just doesn't make much sense. Also, as someone who went to MIT and Harvard, it's really interesting to hear Benjamin Netanyahu make statements about free speech on America's campuses.
That's a good point. And, you know, my fundamental problem with a lot of the media coverage of these protests is trying to really paint the protesters with a broad brush. There are some incidents that we've seen on camera of anti-Semitism. There are some incidents of perhaps violent action. But it's obviously not fair to apply that to every single protester that's on these campuses. And I think the sort of rub here is that we should be absolutely supporting the right to free speech. We should be acknowledging that these people have a right to protest. And then the sort of conflict comes into tension with campus policies. For example, policies against having a physical encampment, perhaps policies against protesters blocking people's access to public parts of campus. You know, they pay tuition as well, so they should be able to use those areas where they have these sort of autonomous zones set up. And if students, you know, get a warning and then are told that they have to get off campus or they will face suspension, then they have to be prepared for those consequences. But I don't like this idea that's actually coming from some people on the right or from conservatives that because Jewish students feel unsafe, that's why we have to crack down on the protesters, not because they're violating campus policy. And to me, that is the exact same argument that some leftists and progressives used to shut down conservative speech on campus in the past 10 years or so, was this idea that the speech was dangerous because it was threatening to students' mental health. It made them feel afraid, even if it wasn't explicitly threatening. So I don't want the right to turn around and use that exact same argument against these pro-Palestinian protesters. To me, it seems like a fundamental hypocrisy there.
Right. A lot of people have been circulating this screen grab of Columbia University's website where they talk about their response to protests by students during the Vietnam War and how much they regret how students were treated, how they regret calling the police in to arrest these students. And it's insane to think that because they posted this apology that they're going to assess student protests differently because they're taking the same course of action. To see professors like that old lady get brutalized by police is insane. And it's at a time when there's not a lot of trust in the police in the United States of America to protect people, protesting over a foreign war, to protect, the general public from them with some assessment that they're being violent by simply camping out, when what they're protesting is probably the most violent force in the world, the U.S. military-industrial complex. It almost makes the police seem like an arm of the U.S. military-industrial complex, which, when we see the militarization of the police and police carrying the level of weapons and sometimes having tanks, that's not right. It shouldn't sit right with any citizen who wants to live in a free country that there's that disparity of power between, a regular citizen and a police officer. It makes it seem like, the police are there to regulate the citizens rather than keep the citizens safe, to keep the citizens in check from expressing ideas that run counter to the U.S. military-industrial complex. It's not popular to be sending aid to Israel right now, and to have students protesting by camping out. It's a pretty common form of protest. It's a very nonviolent form of protest. And so we're at this place where this response just feels so wrong that I think it's making more people take a really hard look at the $16 billion that just went over to Israel and saying, why is the government doing something that is so unpopular among the people that students are willing to risk getting brutalized by the police over?
Yeah, I think the particulars of what they're protesting for are, frankly, in my opinion, kind of idiotic. The idea of the universities having to divest from index funds, essentially, which I don't know whose parents are, I don't know who the parents of these students are, but I assume a lot of their parents have 401ks or IRAs or other investments in the stock market. They would presumably be invested in index funds. Pretty much every pension account, retirement fund is invested in index funds. And so I think their ire would be better directed towards places like BlackRock that actually put together, or Vanguard that actually put together these funds, as opposed to the universities who are simply trying to exercise their fiduciary duty, which is to get the best return on investment on the money that they get from donors, the money that's in their endowment. I don't think that they're the right target of this protest. But that being said, I completely agree that the universities have kind of miscalculated here, because if they were going to enforce these types of policies, which they never have really in the past, they've sort of let students kind of do whatever they want when it comes to these protests, whether it's sit-ins on campus or previous encampments. And now to exercise it now, you give the impression that you're not actually interested in process-related questions to speech on campus, but you're interested in the content of that speech. And what it's done is it's given this effect of giving more power to the protesters, because they've brought all of this media attention to them. They've popped up on other campuses from students who are trying to show their support for what's been happening at Columbia. And so they've actually only inflamed the tensions even more and given more air to what's going on just through their aggressive crackdown. So I think just from a strategy standpoint, that was a huge miscalculation.
Absolutely. I think a lot of the protesters, right, are talking about divestment, sanctions. But I think the majority of them are showing up because they know that these universities have very powerful alumni networks that pay attention to what happens on campus. But if you look at the balance sheet of universities, it's insane. When we've seen the skyrocketing of tuition over the past 50 years or so, I've always wondered, what are they doing with all this money? Are they immediately spending it year over year? Is the actual money that they need to spend to facilitate a student being on campus that much? Where is it going? And if you look, it's required by the federal government that they disclose, what their balance sheet looks like every year. And they accumulate so much money that really sits there. And they have their endowments, but they also have huge accounts. And so when we think about the amount of money that goes towards investments by universities to grow the total sum of money that they have, I mean, it's kind of insane. Just the sum of money that they're getting from each student year over year, but that they're not spending a lot of it. And so I think it's almost this kind of taxation without representation, or rather, you pay your money into the university, you want it to go towards having a quality education or things that make the university better or alumni networks better. But when the university is simply, investing the dollars that they rake in through alumni donations or what have you, and they sit on large pools of money, and are investing in, corporations that are profiting off of what Israel is doing. As a student, I'm sure that doesn't feel right. And so it's one ask they can have, but I think most students are just showing up because they want their voices to be heard. That's where they are right now. Young people are more likely to take action than many others, which is something, we've seen throughout history in the United States. And I think most people are just showing up because it feels wrong to be at one of these elite institutions, very comfortable, getting a good education, when there are people starving, thanks to, in part, American tax dollars.
I do agree that universities should absolutely be using some of this massive war chest that they have in order to reduce tuition rates for students instead of hiking them every single year. And one of the conflicts that I have with these protests in particular is that there are a lot of students on campus who are paying exorbitant tuition fees, who should be able to study in the library, for example, for their finals without having that giant encampment with people banging on pots and yelling at all hours of the night. I imagine that's quite unfair for them to be paying the same amount of money and not be able to access the education that they're really paying for. I mean, fundamentally, I think the university should be a place where people can go and get a good education and develop their critical thinking skills, as opposed to really just being an epicenter for activism. So that's sort of the conflict that I find myself running into. But I think we agree on just the fundamental speech question here, and we're going to be back with more Rising after this.